I'm Tyler Bennett, 27 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. Growing up, I watched my parents shower my older brother Ethan with praise while I scraped for crumbs of their attention. I thought that was the worst they could do to me. I was wrong. 3 weeks before I was supposed to marry the woman I loved, my parents handed her $50,000 in cash to walk away from me. They paid her to shatter my heart, to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew, to leave me standing alone at the altar we'd chosen together. And she took it. Every single dollar. When I discovered the truth, something inside me didn't just break. It transformed. They wanted to destroy my happiness to protect their precious vision of what my life should be. Instead, they lit a fire that would consume everything they held dear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the windows of my small apartment in Portland's Selwood district, each drop echoing the hollow feeling that had settled in my chest. It was March and the Pacific Northwest was doing what it does best, turning the world gray and cold. But the chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather. I sat at my desk surrounded by half-finished graphic design projects, my laptop screen glowing in the dim light. The wedding invitations I'd designed myself mocked me from the corner of my workspace. Elegant script announcing a celebration that would never happen. Jessica Monroe, the woman I'd planned to spend my life with, had vanished from my world exactly 72 hours ago. We'd been together for 4 years. I met her at a gallery opening in downtown Portland, where I was displaying some of my design work. She was an elementary school teacher with a laugh that could fill a room, and a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel significant. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real, or so I believed. We'd navigated the challenges of my difficult family together, her hand in mine during countless dinners where my parents fawned over Ethan's achievements in corporate real estate, while barely acknowledging my presence. Jessica had been my anchor, the one person who made me feel like I mattered. The engagement happened on a camping trip to Crater Lake. I'd planned it for months, designing a custom ring box that incorporated elements from our favorite memories together. When she said yes, tears streaming down her face as the sun set over the impossibly blue water, I felt like I'd finally won at something. My parents' reaction was lukewarm at best. Diane, my mother, had pursed her lips and offered a tight smile. Robert, my father, had shaken my hand with all the enthusiasm of someone congratulating a stranger on a minor accomplishment. Ethan had clapped me on the back and said something about it being a big step, his tone suggesting I was making a mistake. I'd brushed off their coldness, telling myself that their approval didn't matter anymore. Planning the wedding became my obsession. As a graphic designer, I threw myself into every visual detail. I designed the invitations, the programs, the seating charts, and the signage. Jessica and I chose the venue together. A restored barn in the Willamette Valley with views of vineyard-covered hills. We'd spent weekends tasting cakes, sampling catering menus, and arguing playfully about whether to have a DJ or a live band. We'd settled on live music, a jazz quartet that could transition into something more upbeat for dancing. I'd even designed a custom monogram that would appear on everything from the napkins to the dance floor projection. My parents contributed nothing. Not financially, not emotionally, not even a genuine word of encouragement. Diane would ask pointed questions about Jessica's family background, her salary as a teacher, whether she planned to continue working after we had children. Robert would grunt non-committally when I shared updates about our plans, more interested in discussing Ethan's latest real estate deal. My brother, always the golden child, had married 2 years earlier in an extravagant ceremony that my parents had funded entirely. His wife, Amanda, came from old Portland money, the kind of family that summered in Cannon Beach and had a box at the opera. That wedding had cost north of $100,000, every penny cheerfully provided by Diane and Robert. For my wedding, I was on my own. Jessica and I pooled our savings, $12,000 that represented years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. I took on extra freelance projects, working late into the night to build up our wedding fund. Jessica picked up summer school teaching gigs and tutoring work. We weren't asking for a lavish affair, just something meaningful and beautiful, a celebration with the people we loved. The guest list was modest, 80 people including family, friends, and a few colleagues. We'd budgeted carefully, making choices that prioritized what mattered to us. Better food over expensive flowers. A great photographer over elaborate decorations. Quality over spectacle. 3 weeks before the wedding, everything fell apart. Jessica had been acting strange for about a week, distracted and quiet. When I'd ask if something was wrong, she'd shake her head and force a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I attributed it to wedding stress, the normal anxiety that comes with a major life change. Then on a Tuesday evening, she asked to meet me at Riverside Cafe, our usual spot in the neighborhood. Something in her voice over the phone made my stomach drop. I arrived early, ordering her favorite drink, a lavender latte, hoping to ease whatever tension she was carrying. She walked in looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red, her movements mechanical. We sat at our usual table by the window, rain streaking the glass beside us. The cafe buzzed with the normal evening crowd, people laughing over their laptops and conversations, completely unaware that my world was about to implode. Jessica wrapped her hands around the cup I'd ordered for her but didn't drink. She stared at the table, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. She couldn't marry me. She'd made a mistake. We weren't right for each other. The words came out rehearsed, like she'd practiced them in front of a mirror. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. Questions tumbled out of me. Why now? What changed? Was there someone else? Could we work through whatever this was? She shook her head to everything, tears sliding down her cheeks, but her answers remained vague and unconvincing. She loved me, she said, but love wasn't enough. She needed something different, something she couldn't articulate. When I reached for her hand, she pulled away like my touch burned her. She stood up, leaving the untouched latte on the table, and walked out of the cafe. I sat there for an hour, stunned into immobility, while my coffee went cold and the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows. The next 72 hours were a blur of grief and logistics. I had to contact vendors, canceling or postponing everything we'd booked. The venue was understanding but kept half the deposit. The caterer was less sympathetic. The photographer offered to reschedule without penalty, her voice thick with pity that made me want to scream. I sent a mass email to our guests, a brief message explaining that the wedding was off. No details provided. My phone exploded with concern messages, but I couldn't bring myself to respond to most of them. The only person I talked to was Carlos Martinez, my best friend since college. Carlos came over the night after Jessica left, arriving with Thai food and beer. He sat with me on my couch while I alternated between rage and despair, letting me vent without judgment. Carlos worked as a software engineer at a startup downtown, pragmatic and level-headed in a way that balanced out my more emotional nature. He'd never fully trusted Jessica, though he'd kept that opinion mostly to himself. There was something about her that seemed performative, he'd said once, like she was always aware of how she appeared to others. I dismissed it as Carlos being overprotective. Now his words echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. My parents' reaction to the breakup was perhaps the strangest part. When I called to tell them, expecting at least some semblance of parental concern, Diane's response was almost cheerful. "Oh honey, these things happen. You'll find someone better." Robert had grunted something about dodging a bullet. Ethan, when I spoke to him, seemed relieved. "Jessica was nice enough," he said, "but I never thought she was quite right for you. Too much of a dreamer, not enough ambition." Their lack of empathy should have hurt, but I was too numb to register it as anything more than typical behavior. I threw myself into work, accepting every project that came my way. Designing logos for startups, creating marketing materials for local businesses, building websites for clients I'd normally screen more carefully. Anything to fill the hours and quiet the questions that plagued me at night. Why had she really left? What had I done wrong? How had I missed the signs? Sleep became elusive, my apartment feeling both too empty and too full of memories. The coffee maker Jessica had bought me sat and used on the counter. Her favorite mug, the one with the ridiculous cat meme, remained in my cabinet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Because I couldn't bring myself to throw it away or look at it. Carlos checked on me daily, sometimes just showing up with food or dragging me out for walks along the river. He was working on a major project at his startup, but he made time, sensing that I was spiraling in ways I wasn't fully admitting. One evening, about 2 weeks after Jessica had left, We were at a bar in Northeast Portland, a dive place we'd frequented in college. The beer was cheap, the music was loud, and the crowd was young enough that I felt ancient at 27. Carlos was telling me about a disastrous date he'd been on, trying to make me laugh, when his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it, and his expression changed, his jaw tightening in a way that made me sit up straighter. "What is it?" I asked, the noise of the bar fading into background static. Carlos hesitated, his fingers hovering over his phone screen. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between anger and pity. "Tyler, I need to show you something," he said, his voice cutting through the music. "But you're not going to like it." He handed me his phone, open to a text conversation with his sister, Maria. Maria worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, the kind of firm that handled estate planning and wealth management for Portland's upper crust. The text was brief but devastating. "Isn't Tyler your friend? My boss just processed a wire transfer from Diane and Robert Bennett to Jessica Monroe. $50,000. Memo line said, personal matter. Thought you should know." The bar seemed to tilt around me. I read the text 3 times, the words refusing to make sense. $50,000. From my parents. To Jessica. A personal matter. Carlos was talking, his voice urgent, but I couldn't process what he was saying. My hands started shaking, and I had to set the phone down on the sticky bar surface before I dropped it. The noise of the bar rushed back in, overwhelming and disorienting. People were laughing, music was playing, glasses were clinking, and my entire understanding of reality was crumbling. "When?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Carlos took his phone back, his expression grim. "According to Maria, the transfer was processed 8 days ago." 8 days ago? That was 3 days before Jessica had broken up with me at the cafe. 3 days before she'd walked out of my life with her rehearsed speech about not being right for each other. The timeline slotted into place with horrible clarity. My parents had paid her. They had literally paid the woman I loved to leave me, and she had accepted. The anger that rose in me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold, calculated. A fury that sharpened my thoughts rather than clouding them. Carlos was still talking, suggesting we confront my parents, maybe speak to a lawyer, but I barely heard him. A plan was already forming in my mind, pieces clicking together with crystal clarity. My parents thought they could manipulate my life, could pay off the woman I loved to protect their vision of what I should be. They thought I would crumble, that I would come crawling back to them, grateful for their interference in the long run. They had no idea what they'd actually done. They hadn't broken me. They'd freed me from any remaining loyalty or obligation I felt toward them. I pulled out my own phone and opened my banking app. The $12,000 Jessica and I had saved for the wedding sat in our joint account, money we'd pooled together over 2 years. Technically, half of it was hers, but given the circumstances, I felt no guilt about what I was about to do. I transferred the entire amount to my personal account. Then I opened my contact list and started making calls. First to the venue, confirming that our deposit was forfeit but that no further charges would be processed. Then to every vendor we'd booked, ensuring that nothing tied to my name would result in additional costs. The photographer, the florist, the caterer, the jazz quartet, all of them received calls canceling definitively rather than postponing. Carlos watched me work through my list with growing understanding. "What are you planning?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew I was past the point of reason. "I'm planning to disappear," I told him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I'm planning to take everything I've built here and start over somewhere they can't touch me. And I'm planning to make sure they understand exactly what their manipulation cost them." Carlos nodded slowly, and instead of trying to talk me out of it, he asked a simple question. "What do you need from me?" I spent the next week moving through Portland like a ghost, systematically dismantling the life I'd built there. My apartment lease was month to month, a fortunate quirk of renting from an elderly landlord who preferred flexibility over long-term contracts. I gave notice, citing a job opportunity out of state, and my landlord accepted without question. The graphic design clients I'd accumulated over 5 years received professional emails explaining that I was relocating and would be transitioning their projects to trusted colleagues. Most were understanding, a few were disappointed, but none could argue with the quality of the referrals I provided. Carlos helped me sort through my belongings, his presence a steady anchor as I made ruthless decisions about what to keep and what to discard. The furniture went to a consignment shop, pieces I'd accumulated over the years suddenly feeling like anchors rather than possessions. Books I'd collected since college were donated to the local library, except for a handful of favorites that fit into the 2 large suitcases I'd purchased. Kitchen items, decorations, the accumulated detritus of adult life, all of it went to Goodwill in multiple trips that felt increasingly liberating. The hardest items to deal with were the ones connected to Jessica. The photographs we'd taken on various trips, tucked into frames around the apartment. The small gifts she'd given me over the years, a vintage typewriter she'd found at an estate sale, a leather journal embossed with my initials, a coffee table book about Scandinavian design. I packed these into a box and left it at Carlos's place, unable to throw them away but unwilling to carry them forward. He promised to store it indefinitely, no questions asked, though we both knew I'd probably never ask for it back. My parents remained blissfully unaware of my plans. I didn't call them, didn't visit, simply let them assume I was licking my wounds in private. Ethan tried to reach out once, a text message suggesting we grab lunch, but I ignored it. The distance felt appropriate, a buffer zone I was creating before the final confrontation. Because I wasn't leaving Portland without making sure they understood what they'd done. The confrontation needed to happen on my terms, in a setting where they couldn't dismiss or minimize their actions. I spent hours researching cities where I could relocate, somewhere different enough from Portland that I wouldn't be constantly reminded of what I'd lost, but not so foreign that I'd struggle to establish myself. Austin kept appearing in my searches. The design scene was thriving there, a mix of tech startups and creative agencies that valued the kind of work I did. The cost of living was reasonable compared to Portland, and the weather, while hot, represented a complete departure from the constant gray rain I'd lived under for years. I found a sublet available immediately, a 1-bedroom apartment in East Austin that the current tenant needed to vacate due to a sudden job transfer. The rent was within my budget, and the neighborhood had the kind of eclectic energy that appealed to me. Carlos drove me around Portland during my final days there, a farewell tour of sorts. We hit all our old haunts, the taco place on Hawthorne where we'd spent countless late nights during college, the bookstore in Pioneer Square where I'd proposed to Jessica, the hiking trails in Forest Park where I'd gone to clear my head during difficult times. Each location carried weight, memories layered like sediment, but I found I could observe them without the crushing grief I'd felt initially. Anger had a clarifying effect, burning away the softer emotions and leaving something harder and more focused in its place. Maria Martinez, Carlos's sister, proved to be an unexpected ally. She met us for coffee one afternoon at a place downtown, her professional demeanor softening as she explained what she knew about the transaction. Her firm had processed the wire transfer as a routine matter. No questions asked because Diane and Robert Bennett were established clients with significant assets under management. The memo line, personal matter, was deliberately vague, the kind of notation that discouraged scrutiny. Maria had only noticed it because she recognized my name from Carlos's stories over the years. She'd done some additional digging, careful to stay within ethical boundaries. The transfer had been initiated by Diane, with Robert's co-signature required due to the amount. Jessica had provided her banking information, and the funds had cleared within 24 hours. There was no contract, no formal agreement, just a straightforward payment from my parents to my ex-fiancé. Maria couldn't access the communications that preceded the transfer, but the timing suggested it had been planned carefully. My parents had approached Jessica, made their offer, and she'd accepted with enough time before the wedding to make her exit seem like a personal decision rather than a transaction. The knowledge that Jessica had been bought, that she'd valued $50,000 more than 4 years of our relationship, settled into my chest like a stone. I wanted to confront her, to hear her justify what she'd done, but Carlos talked me out of it. "She's not worth your time," he said firmly. "She showed you who she is. Believe her and move on." His logic was sound, but the wound still throbbed. I'd loved her. I'd built a future around her. And she'd traded all of it for a paycheck from my parents. My graphic design business had always been a solo operation, but I'd built a solid reputation over 5 years. Clients came through referrals, and my portfolio showcased work for local restaurants, boutique shops, and a few regional nonprofits. I'd never pursued the big corporate contracts that Ethan constantly suggested I should chase, preferring the creative freedom that came with smaller, more personal projects. Now I was grateful for that independence. There were no business partners to negotiate with, no office lease to break, no employees to lay off. I could simply close up shop and reopen elsewhere. I drafted emails to my regular clients, professional and warm, explaining that I was relocating, but would be happy to continue working with them remotely if they were interested. Several responded immediately, expressing disappointment but understanding. A few asked for recommendations, which I provided, connecting them with designers I respected in the Portland scene. 2 clients, a craft brewery and an independent bookstore, said they'd continue working with me regardless of location. Their loyalty touched me more than I'd expected, a reminder that not everyone in Portland was part of the toxicity I was leaving behind. The financial aspect of my departure required careful calculation. I had the $12,000 from the wedding account, plus about $8,000 in personal savings. $20,000 wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to relocate and establish myself while I rebuilt my client base. I'd sold my car, a beat-up Subaru that had served me well, but wasn't worth the cost of transporting to Texas. The sale added another $3,000 to my moving fund. I'd arranged for my belongings to be shipped to Austin, a modest load that would arrive a few days after I did. My parents had a standing family dinner every Sunday at their house in the West Hills, an area of Portland where old money lived behind gates and manicured lawns. Ethan and Amanda attended religiously, playing the role of the perfect son and daughter-in-law. I'd skipped the last 2 dinners, citing work deadlines, which was accepted without comment. For my final week in Portland, I decided to make one last appearance. Not to reconcile, not to seek closure, but to ensure they understood the consequences of their actions. I arrived at their house exactly on time, parking on the street rather than in their circular driveway. The house was a sprawling Tudor revival purchased decades ago, when the neighborhood was merely expensive rather than astronomical. Diane took pride in the place, maintaining it with the help of a gardener and a housekeeper who came twice weekly. The front garden was immaculate even in early spring. Precisely trimmed hedges and strategically placed stone features creating an impression of elegant permanence. Robert answered the door, his expression registering surprise at seeing me. He was in his early 60s, his hair silver but still thick, his posture erect from years of golf and what he called proper discipline. "Tyler," he said, his tone neutral. "We didn't expect you tonight." I smiled, the expression feeling foreign on my face. "Surprise," I said simply, stepping past him into the foyer. The house smelled like it always did. A combination of furniture polish and whatever elaborate meal Diane had prepared. Diane appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She was dressed as she always was for family dinners, business casual attire that suggested she'd just come from an important meeting even though she'd been retired for 3 years. Her face registered the same surprise as Robert's, followed quickly by something that might have been apprehension. "Tyler, darling," she said, her voice overly bright. "We heard about Jessica. Such a shame, but probably for the best in the long run." Ethan and Amanda were already in the dining room, seated at the long table that could accommodate 12 but usually held just the 5 of us. Ethan stood when I entered, his corporate realtor smile firmly in place. "Little brother," he said, the nickname grating as always. "Good to see you." Amanda offered a small wave, her attention mostly on her phone. She worked in marketing for a luxury hotel chain, a job that seemed to consist primarily of posting on social media and attending networking events. We sat down to dinner, a production Diane had clearly spent hours preparing. Roasted chicken with herbs, scalloped potatoes, roasted vegetables, fresh bread from a bakery she favored. The wine was expensive, a bottle Robert opened with practiced ease. The conversation started with safe topics, Ethan's latest real estate deal, Amanda's upcoming trip to a conference in San Diego, Robert's golf game. I ate silently, waiting for the right moment, feeling the weight of what I knew pressing against my chest. Diane finally addressed me directly, her voice carefully sympathetic. "How are you holding up, sweetheart? I know the breakup must have been difficult." The endearment sounded false, a performance of maternal concern she'd never genuinely offered. I set down my fork, meeting her eyes across the table. "I'm doing surprisingly well," I said, my voice even. "In fact, I've made some exciting decisions about my future." Robert perked up at this, always interested in what he considered productive life choices. "Oh? What kind of decisions?" I took a sip of wine, letting the moment stretch. "I'm moving to Austin. Leaving Portland entirely, actually. I've already given notice on my apartment, transferred my clients, and shipped most of my belongings. I leave in 3 days." The table went silent. Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Amanda's eyes widened, finally pulled away from her phone. Diane's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on forced cheer. "Austin? That's quite sudden. Is this because of Jessica?" The way she said Jessica's name with a slight emphasis made my jaw clench. "Actually," I said, setting down my wine glass with deliberate care, "Jessica is part of why I'm leaving, but not in the way you think." I pulled out my phone, opening it to a screenshot Maria had provided, the wire transfer details with my parents' names clearly visible. I placed the phone on the table, turning it so they could all see. "I'm leaving because I discovered that my parents paid my ex-fiancé $50,000 to break up with me 3 weeks before our wedding." The silence that followed was absolute. Diane's face went pale, then flushed. Robert's expression hardened into something defensive. Ethan leaned forward, squinting at the phone screen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Amanda, for once, looked genuinely shocked rather than politely disinterested. "Tyler," Diane started, her voice shaking slightly, "let me explain." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "No. You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify. You paid the woman I love to walk away from me. You manipulated my life because you didn't approve of my choices. And you did it in a way designed to make me think it was my fault, that I'd somehow failed in the relationship." Robert found his voice, the gruff authority he'd always relied on. "We did what we thought was best. Jessica wasn't right for you. She wasn't from our world, didn't have the ambition or background that would benefit your future. We gave her an opportunity to do the right thing and she took it. That tells you everything you need to know about her character." The arrogance of his words, the complete lack of remorse, ignited something in me. "You gave her an opportunity? You mean you offered her enough money that a teacher making $40,000 a year couldn't refuse? You exploited her financial situation to destroy my relationship. And you did it without ever considering that maybe, just maybe, I got to choose who I loved." Diane's mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "You've always been too emotional, Tyler. Too willing to settle for less than you deserve. Jessica was nice enough, but she had no connections, no family wealth, no prospects. You would have spent your life supporting her mediocre career, while your own potential languished. We did you a favor, even if you can't see it now." The words hung in the air, brutal in their honesty. This was what they really thought. This was how they'd always seen me, as someone whose choices needed to be managed, whose happiness was less important than their vision of success. Ethan, always the peacemaker when it benefited him, tried to intervene. "Tyler, I get that you're upset, but maybe we should all take a breath here." Mom and Dad were trying to help, even if their method was questionable. I turned to my brother, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't just the golden child. He was complicit, comfortable in a system that elevated him while diminishing me. "Were you in on this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Ethan's hesitation was answer enough. "I didn't know the specifics," he admitted. "But Mom mentioned they were concerned about your engagement. I might have agreed that Jessica seemed like a limiting factor for your career." The betrayal was complete. Not just my parents but my brother too, all of them conspiring to control my life according to their metrics of success and propriety. I stood up, pushing back from the table. "I want you all to understand something. I'm not leaving Portland because I'm running away. I'm leaving because staying here, maintaining any relationship with this family, would be accepting that what you did was okay. It's not okay. It's manipulative, cruel, and unforgivable." Diane stood as well, her voice rising. "You're being dramatic. In a few months you'll calm down and realize we were right. You'll thank us for saving you from a mistake." Her conviction, her absolute certainty that she knew better than I did about my own life, was staggering. "I will never thank you," I said, each word deliberate. "I will never forgive you. And I will never, as long as I live, give you the satisfaction of being part of my success or my happiness. Robert's face darkened, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used when he wanted to shut down dissent. You're being childish. This family has given you everything, and this is how you repay us. By throwing a tantrum and running away? The accusation was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that I almost laughed. Given me everything? You gave Ethan everything. You funded his college without loans, bought him his first car, paid for his wedding, helped with his down payment. I worked my way through school, bought my own car, and saved for a wedding you undermined. The only thing you've consistently given me is the message that I'm not enough. Amanda surprisingly spoke up. Tyler has a point, she said quietly, earning a sharp look from Ethan. The way you talk about him compared to how you talk about Ethan, it's always been different. I've noticed it. Her small act of honesty, coming from someone I'd barely considered an ally, shifted something in the room. Diane turned on her, but Amanda continued. I'm not saying what you did was okay or not okay. I'm saying Tyler isn't wrong about the favoritism. Ethan shot his wife a warning look, but she'd already said enough. The cracks in the family facade were showing, small fissures that might widen over time. I picked up my phone from the table, pocketing it. I'm leaving now. I'm leaving Portland. And I'm leaving all of you behind. Don't call me. Don't email me. Don't try to find me. As far as I'm concerned, you stopped being my family the moment you paid Jessica to leave. Diane's voice cracked, a rare show of genuine emotion breaking through her composure. Tyler, please. You're our son. We can work through this. But her words felt hollow, a reflexive attempt to maintain control rather than genuine remorse. No, I said simply. We can't. Because working through this would require you to acknowledge that what you did was wrong, and I don't think you're capable of that. I walked toward the front door, my footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged foyer. Robert called after me, his voice hard. If you walk out that door, don't come back expecting anything from us. No financial help, no family support, nothing. I turned back, meeting his eyes. I've never expected anything from you. That's the difference between us. I know how to build a life on my own terms. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt appropriate. I stood on their perfect front steps, breathing in the cool Portland evening air, and felt lighter than I had in weeks. The confrontation hadn't brought closure, exactly, but it had brought clarity. They would never understand what they'd done. They would never apologize. And I no longer needed them to. Carlos was waiting for me at a bar downtown, our agreed-upon meeting spot after the dinner. He took one look at my face and ordered 2 whiskeys without asking what I wanted. How bad was it? He asked, sliding a glass toward me. Exactly as bad as expected, I said, downing half the whiskey in one swallow. They don't think they did anything wrong. If anything, they're offended that I'm upset about it. He shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and resignation. Some people are so committed to their worldview that reality can't touch them. Your parents are those people. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the bar filling up with the evening crowd. Young professionals unwinding after work, couples on dates, groups of friends laughing too loudly. Normal life continuing around us while mine was in upheaval. You're really doing this, Carlos said eventually. Not a question but a confirmation. I'm really doing this, I agreed. Austin awaits. New city, new life, new Tyler Bennett who doesn't carry the weight of their expectations. He raised his glass and I clinked mine against it. To new beginnings, he said, and to leaving toxic people behind where they belong. The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations. I closed my bank accounts at the Portland Credit Union where I'd banked for years, transferring everything to a national bank with branches in Austin. I returned my library books, canceled my gym membership, updated my address with various institutions and services. Each task felt like untethering another rope, cutting another line that connected me to this place and these people. Jessica tried to call once. I watched her name light up my phone screen and felt nothing but a distant curiosity about what she might say. Did she know I knew about the money? Was she calling to explain, to apologize, to justify? I let it go to voicemail but never listened to the message. Whatever she had to say didn't matter anymore. She'd made her choice and I'd made mine. Carlos drove me to the airport on a Wednesday morning, the city still waking up under its characteristic gray sky. We didn't talk much during the drive, both of us aware that this was an ending of sorts. Carlos had been my anchor in Portland, the one person who'd consistently seen me and valued me for who I was rather than who I was supposed to be. Leaving him behind was the only part of this departure that genuinely hurt. At the airport drop-off, we stood awkwardly by his car while travelers rushed past with their rolling luggage. "You're going to kill it in Austin," Carlos said finally, pulling me into a brief hug. "And I'm visiting. That's non-negotiable." I managed a smile, the first genuine one in weeks. "You better. I'll need someone to remind me why I did this when the Texas heat tries to murder me." He watched me walk into the terminal and I didn't look back. Looking back felt like an invitation to doubt, and I couldn't afford doubt right now. The flight to Austin was uneventful. A few hours in the air with nothing but my thoughts and a book I couldn't focus on. When the plane descended toward Austin Bergstrom International, I looked out the window at the sprawling city below, all Texas-sized highways and buildings glinting in actual sunshine, and felt the first stirring of something that might have been hope. Austin hit me like a wall of heat the moment I stepped out of the airport. It was late March, a time when Portland would still be drizzling and gray, but Texas was already pushing 80 degrees with humidity that made the air feel thick. I'd arranged for a rideshare to my new apartment, and the driver, a chatty woman named Rosa, spent the entire drive pointing out landmarks and offering unsolicited advice about the best tacos in town. Her enthusiasm was jarring after weeks of emotional devastation, but somehow it felt appropriate. This burst of genuine warmth from a stranger who knew nothing about my history. The apartment I'd rented sight unseen was in a neighborhood called East Austin, an area Rosa informed me was gentrifying rapidly, but still retained some of its original character. The building was a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures, divided into loft-style units. Mine was on the third floor, accessible by an elevator that groaned ominously but functioned. The previous tenant had left it spotlessly clean, and the space was larger than I'd expected from the photos, with high ceilings and massive windows that flooded the room with natural light. I spent my first night in Austin on an air mattress, my shipped belongings still in transit, eating takeout barbecue that Rosa had recommended. The brisket was objectively excellent, smoky and tender, but I barely tasted it. Exhaustion had caught up with me, not just physical but emotional, the accumulated weight of the past month finally demanding acknowledgement. I fell asleep early, the unfamiliar sounds of the city filtering through the windows, car horns and distant music and voices speaking Spanish in animated conversation somewhere below. The next morning I woke disoriented, sunlight streaming through uncurtained windows, momentarily forgetting where I was. Then reality reasserted itself. Austin, fresh start, family left behind in Portland. I made coffee using the ancient machine the previous tenant had left behind, standing at the window and watching the neighborhood come to life. There was a taco truck setting up on the corner, a group of runners passing by in matching shirts, a man walking 3 dogs of wildly different sizes. Life happening in all its ordinary chaos, indifferent to my personal drama. My belongings arrived 2 days later, delivered by movers who complained about the elevator and the stairs in equal measure. I tipped them well and spent the afternoon unpacking, creating a space that felt intentionally different from my Portland apartment. The furniture I'd kept was minimal: a desk, a bed frame, a single bookshelf. Everything else I acquired from local thrift stores and a massive flea market Rosa had mentioned. Mismatched chairs, a vintage coffee table with water stains, industrial shelving units that fit the warehouse aesthetic. The result was eclectic and imperfect, which felt right for this version of my life. Establishing my graphic design business in Austin proved easier than I'd anticipated. The 2 Portland clients who'd agreed to continue working with me remotely provided immediate income and portfolio pieces I could show to potential new clients. I created a simple website showcasing my work, emphasizing my experience with small businesses and nonprofits. Within a week I'd landed my first Austin client, a woman named Rebecca who owned a vintage clothing store in South Congress. She needed a rebrand, everything from a new logo to signage to social media templates. The project was exactly the kind of creative challenge I thrived on, and Rebecca's enthusiasm reminded me why I'd gotten into design in the first place. I discovered Austin's coffee shop culture by working my way through different locations each day. There were the slick corporate chains, predictable and efficient, but more interesting were the independent spots tucked into unexpected places. A cafe inside a plant nursery where customers worked surrounded by ferns and succulents. A combination coffee shop and vinyl record store where the baristas doubled as DJs. A minimalist space that served only 2 types of coffee, black or with milk, but made them with obsessive precision. Each location offered a different energy, and I found myself drawn to variety rather than establishing a single regular spot. Money was tight but manageable. I'd budgeted carefully, knowing that building a client base would take time. The $12,000 from the wedding account plus my savings gave me a cushion of about 6 months if I was careful. Rent was my biggest expense, followed by groceries and the occasional meal out. I cut other costs ruthlessly, canceling subscription services I'd accumulated over years, shopping at discount grocery stores, walking instead of using rideshares whenever possible. The discipline felt appropriate, a conscious choice to build something sustainable rather than impressive. The isolation of those first weeks was both challenging and necessary. I'd left behind not just my family but an entire social ecosystem, the friends and acquaintances who'd populated my Portland life. In Austin I was anonymous, which felt liberating and lonely in equal measure. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text someone about a funny observation or interesting design I'd seen, then remember that the people I'd text were all connected to a life I'd deliberately abandoned. The silence forced me to sit with my own thoughts in a way I'd been avoiding for years. I started running in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, finding trails along the Colorado River that offered temporary escape from the urban density. The physical exertion helped quiet the mental noise, the endless loops of anger and hurt and what-if scenarios that plagued my quiet moments. During these runs I'd process the betrayal in fragments, allowing myself to feel the full weight of what my parents had done without the pressure of maintaining composure for others. Sometimes I'd finish a run with tears mixing with sweat, other times with a clarity that felt almost meditative. Austin's design community was welcoming in a way Portland's had never been. I started attending meetups advertised on various professional networks, awkward gatherings in co-working spaces where designers, developers, and creative professionals networked over cheap beer and pizza. Most people were transplants like me, drawn to Austin by its reputation as a creative hub with a lower cost of living than the coasts. The conversations were different from Portland, less concerned with appearing cool or alternative, more focused on practical matters of building careers and businesses. At one of these meetups I met a woman named Jordan who ran a small creative agency specializing in branding for food and beverage companies. She was in her mid-30s, originally from Houston, with a direct communication style I found refreshing after years of Portland passive aggression. We talked about the challenges of freelancing versus agency work, the importance of diversifying client bases, the perpetual struggle of pricing creative work appropriately. When the meetup ended, Jordan handed me her card and suggested we grab coffee sometime to talk more. The gesture felt genuine rather than performative, an actual interest in connection rather than networking theater. I called Carlos every week, our conversations a lifeline to the person who knew my full story. He'd update me on Portland gossip, carefully avoiding mention of my family unless I asked directly. I usually didn't ask, but sometimes curiosity won out. Ethan was apparently having problems at work, something about a deal falling through. Diane had called Carlos's mother, trying to get information about where I was living, but Mrs. Martinez had claimed ignorance. The family grocery store saga continued its downward spiral, though Carlos didn't know details. Hearing these updates produced a complicated mix of satisfaction and detachment, proof that their world was continuing without me, while I built something entirely separate. The Texas heat intensified as April arrived, temperatures climbing into the 90s with a ferocity that made Portland's occasional warm days seem quaint. I adapted, learning to schedule outdoor activities for early morning or evening, keeping my apartment dim during peak heat hours, embracing the aggressive air conditioning that seemed to run constantly. The weather became a metaphor I returned to often. This overwhelming force that couldn't be avoided, only adapted to. My family's toxicity had been like that, a constant pressure that shaped everything until I'd finally chosen to relocate entirely. Rebecca's vintage store project expanded beyond the initial scope, which was both challenging and validating. She loved the logo I designed, a stylized clothes hanger that incorporated her store's name in custom lettering, and wanted to apply it everywhere. Business cards, shopping bags, a hand-painted sign for her storefront, tags for her clothing inventory, even custom stamps for packaging. I worked with local printers and sign makers, building relationships with vendors who could execute my designs. The attention to detail required was exhausting but satisfying, each element contributing to a cohesive brand identity that felt authentic to Rebecca's vision. Through Rebecca, I met other South Congress business owners, a tight-knit community of entrepreneurs who supported each other in ways that felt almost old-fashioned. There was Marcus, who owned a bookstore specializing in rare editions and local authors. Helen, who ran a music venue that hosted everything from jazz quartets to punk bands. Trevor, whose coffee roasting operation supplied half the independent cafes in the neighborhood. They gathered weekly at Helen's venue for an informal dinner, potluck style, where business advice and personal stories flowed freely. Rebecca brought me to one of these dinners in late April, introducing me simply as the designer who finally got my brand right. Helen's venue was called the Mockingbird, a name that felt quintessentially Austin. The space was small, maybe 150 capacity, with a stage against one wall and mismatched seating that gave it a living room vibe. Helen herself was in her 50s, with silver hair cut short and an impressive collection of vintage band t-shirts. She'd bought the venue 15 years earlier when the neighborhood was rough, watched it gentrify around her, and somehow maintained the space's original spirit despite rising property values and changing demographics. She had a sharp wit and zero tolerance for pretension, qualities I appreciated immediately. The dinner group was maybe a dozen people, all small business owners navigating Austin's rapidly changing economy. They talked about rising rents, difficult customers, the challenge of competing with corporate chains, but also about successes, new products, positive reviews, community support. I mostly listened that first evening, absorbing the dynamic, but Helen drew me out with direct questions about my design work and what brought me to Austin. I gave the abbreviated version, recent breakup, needed a change, drawn to Austin's creative scene. She nodded knowingly, as if this story was familiar territory, and simply said, "Well, you landed in the right neighborhood." Marcus, the bookstore owner, needed design work. His store had been operating for a decade, with essentially no branding beyond a hand-painted sign that was fading badly. He wanted a logo, updated signage, and promotional materials for an author event series he was launching. We met at his store a few days after the dinner, and I spent an hour just walking through the space, absorbing the atmosphere. The store smelled like old paper and coffee, with floor-to-ceiling shelves creating narrow aisles that encouraged browsing. Marcus had curated the inventory carefully, prioritizing Texas authors and subjects, rare first editions, and books that major chains wouldn't carry. The logo I designed for Marcus incorporated a mockingbird, a nod both to Texas's state bird and to Helen's venue, with an open book forming the bird's wings. He loved it immediately, that gratifying moment when a client sees exactly what they wanted before they knew how to articulate it. The project expanded like Rebecca's had, and I found myself building a small portfolio of South Congress businesses, each project leading to another through word-of-mouth recommendations. This organic growth felt more sustainable than the hustle of constantly pitching to strangers. By May, I'd reached a point of cautious financial stability. Between the Portland clients I'd retained and the Austin businesses I'd taken on, I was earning enough to cover expenses with a small surplus. Nothing extravagant, but the trajectory was upward rather than desperate. I celebrated by buying actual furniture, a couch from a local maker who specialized in mid-century modern reproductions, and treating myself to dinner at a restaurant Trevor had recommended. The meal was expensive by my current standards, but eating alone at a nice restaurant felt like a declaration of independence, proof that I could create moments of pleasure without anyone's approval or companionship. Jordan, the agency owner I'd met at the networking event, reached out about a collaboration. Her agency had landed a contract with a new brewery opening in East Austin, and the scope was larger than her small team could handle alone. She needed someone to handle the packaging design while her staff focused on other elements of the brand. The project would pay well and give me exposure to Austin's booming craft beer scene. I accepted immediately, recognizing the opportunity not just for income, but for establishing credibility in my new city. The brewery was called Armadillo Amber, a name that embraced Texas kitsch with knowing humor. The founders were two friends from Dallas who'd been home brewers for years before deciding to go professional. They wanted packaging that felt distinctly Texan without resorting to obvious cliches like cowboy hats and longhorns. I spent days researching Texas design history, looking at vintage signage, old beer labels, regional typography. The solution I proposed incorporated elements of the state's mid-century graphic design with contemporary minimalism, an amber color palette with bold geometric shapes that suggested both tradition and innovation. Working with Jordan's agency taught me aspects of the business I'd never encountered as a solo freelancer. The project management systems they used, the client communication protocols, the way they documented decisions and maintained brand consistency across multiple designers. Jordan ran her agency with impressive efficiency, and she was generous about explaining her processes when I asked questions. By the project's end, I had a much clearer sense of how to scale my own business if I chose to, though I wasn't sure I wanted the complexity of managing other people. The Armadillo Amber packaging launched in late June, coinciding with the brewery's grand opening. Jordan invited me to the event, and I went despite my general discomfort with crowded social situations. The brewery's taproom was packed with people, the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against Texas summer heat and body warmth. I found myself talking to strangers about the design process, explaining choices about typography and color, feeling genuinely proud of the work in a way I hadn't experienced in Portland. Several people asked for my business card, and I handed them out feeling like perhaps I was building something real here. Helen found me at the brewery event, appearing at my elbow with 2 beers and a knowing smile. "You clean up nice," she said, handing me one of the beers. I was wearing actual pants instead of my usual shorts, a concession to the professional nature of the event. We found a slightly quieter corner and talked about business, but also about Austin more broadly. Helen had seen the city transform dramatically over her 15 years at the Mockingbird, waves of newcomers bringing money and change that displaced longtime residents while creating new opportunities. She was philosophical about it, recognizing that change was inevitable while working to preserve what made the city special in the first place. She asked about my family, a direct question that caught me off guard. I'd been careful to avoid that topic in Austin, wanting to establish myself separate from that history. But something about Helen's straightforward curiosity made me answer honestly. I gave her the abbreviated version: the paid-off fiancé, the confrontation with my parents, the decision to leave Portland entirely. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, and when I finished she simply said, "Well, their loss is Austin's gain." The simplicity of her response, the lack of pity or advice, felt exactly right. By July I'd been in Austin for 4 months, and the life I was building felt increasingly solid. My client roster had grown to 8 regular businesses, providing steady income that allowed me to start rebuilding my savings. I'd joined a gym, started exploring Austin's extensive hike and bike trails, even adopted a plant from the nursery cafe that had somehow survived my neglect. The apartment no longer felt temporary, and I'd stopped flinching every time my phone rang, expecting confrontation or crisis. Portland and everything it represented had receded to something distant, a chapter that was definitively closed. Carlos visited in late July, claiming he needed a vacation from Portland's summer crowds. We spent a long weekend doing aggressively touristy things, eating barbecue until we felt sick, swimming in Barton Springs pool, staying out too late on 6th Street. It was the first time I'd seen him since leaving Portland, and the physical presence of my closest friend made me realize how much I'd been holding myself at a distance from everyone in Austin. Carlos noticed it too, commenting that I seemed lighter but also more guarded, like I was waiting for something to go wrong. We talked about my family on his last night, sitting on my apartment's small balcony while the city hummed below us. Carlos had run into Ethan at a grocery store, an awkward encounter where my brother had asked about me with what Carlos described as genuine concern. Diane had apparently been calling mutual acquaintances, trying to locate me, though Carlos didn't know why. The information produced a complicated swirl of emotions: anger that they were still trying to exert control, satisfaction that they'd been cut off completely, and underneath it all a trace of something that might have been grief for the family I'd wanted them to be. Carlos left the next morning, making me promise to visit Portland eventually, though we both knew I wouldn't anytime soon. His departure left me feeling both grateful for his friendship and relieved to return to the life I was building alone. Independence had costs, But after years of seeking approval from people who would never give it, the solitude felt earned and necessary. I was learning to be enough for myself, to validate my own choices without external confirmation, and that education required distance from everyone who'd known the smaller version of me. The summer deepened into August, bringing temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees. I adjusted my schedule completely, working in the early mornings when the air was merely warm rather than oppressive, then retreating into air-conditioned spaces during the afternoon inferno. The heat stripped away any romanticism about Texas, revealing it as a place that demanded respect and adaptation. I found myself appreciating the directness of it, the way the environment forced you to either adjust or suffer. No middle ground of comfortable denial. In late August, something unexpected happened that shifted the trajectory of my Austin life in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Helen called me on a Wednesday afternoon, her voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard before. One of her regular acts, a folk duo that performed every Thursday night, had canceled last minute due to a family emergency. She needed promotional materials designed and printed by the next evening, posters and social media graphics announcing a replacement performer. The timeline was absurd, less than 24 hours for work that normally took a week, but something in her voice told me this mattered beyond the usual business transaction. I agreed immediately, clearing my schedule and diving into the project with an intensity that surprised me. The replacement performer was a singer-songwriter named Morgan Ellis, relatively unknown in Austin, but with a small following in the folk music circuit. Helen sent me links to Morgan's music, acoustic songs with lyrics that felt literary and arrangements that showcased genuine musicianship. I worked through the night, designing posters that captured the intimate, thoughtful quality of the music, while remaining bold enough to grab attention in a city oversaturated with live music options. By morning I had files ready for printing, and I personally delivered them to a print shop that owed me a favor. The owner, a gruff man named Ray who'd been in the business for 30 years, pushed my job to the front of his queue. By afternoon I was hanging posters around South Congress, taping them to telephone poles and asking friendly shop owners to display them in their windows. The physical act of promoting the show felt strangely satisfying, a return to tangible work after weeks of digital design. Thursday evening I showed up at the Mockingbird early, ostensibly to see how the promotional materials looked in context, but really because I was curious about this performer I'd spent 18 hours promoting. The venue was filling slowly, a respectable crowd for a Thursday night. Helen spotted me and waved me over to the bar, pouring me a beer without asking. She looked relieved, the tension from yesterday's phone call replaced with her usual confident energy. The posters were working, she said. Several people had mentioned seeing them around the neighborhood. Morgan Ellis arrived an hour before showtime, carrying a guitar case covered in stickers from various music festivals and venues. I'd expected someone older based on the maturity of the songwriting, but Morgan looked to be around my age, maybe slightly younger. There was an easiness to the way Morgan moved through the space, greeting Helen with a hug, chatting casually with the sound engineer, seemingly unbothered by the last-minute nature of the booking. I watched from the bar, trying to reconcile the person with the music I'd listened to while designing. Helen made introductions during soundcheck, explaining how I'd pulled off the impossible timeline for the promotional materials. Morgan's handshake was firm, eyes making direct contact in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than performative gratitude. We talked briefly about the design choices I'd made, and Morgan seemed genuinely engaged with the conversation, asking thoughtful questions about typography and color theory that most musicians wouldn't consider. There was an intelligence behind the casual demeanor that intrigued me. The performance started at 9, and I found a spot near the back of the venue where I could observe without being conspicuous. Morgan's stage presence was understated but commanding, the kind of performer who drew you in through authenticity rather than spectacle. The songs I'd listened to while designing sounded even better live, stripped down to just voice and guitar with occasional harmonica. Between songs, Morgan told stories about the inspiration behind certain lyrics, anecdotes that were funny and self-deprecating without begging for laughs. What struck me most was the honesty in the performance. These were songs about heartbreak, displacement, the struggle to build an artistic life in a world that didn't value art, themes that resonated uncomfortably with my own recent experiences. There was a particular song about leaving home, about cutting ties with people who couldn't see you for who you actually were, That hit so directly I felt exposed despite being anonymous in the crowd. When Morgan sang the line, I traded their approval for my own. I had to look away, blinking against unexpected emotion. After the show, people lingered to buy merchandise and chat with Morgan. I started to leave, feeling like I'd accomplished what I came for, but Helen intercepted me. She insisted I stay for the post-show gathering, a tradition where performers and regular supporters would hang out after the venue closed to the public. I hesitated, my instincts still to maintain distance from new connections, but Helen's expression suggested refusal wasn't really an option. The group that remained was small, maybe 8 people total. Someone ordered pizza, and we sat around pushed-together tables while Morgan answered questions about songwriting and the challenges of touring as an independent artist. I stayed quiet mostly, content to observe, but Morgan kept making eye contact in a way that felt like invitation. Finally, Morgan asked how I'd ended up in Austin, and something about the intimacy of the moment made me offer more truth than usual. Family issues, I said simply. Needed distance from people who couldn't see me clearly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.